Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. It was written in 2015, it is a fantasy novel. It's book 1 of the Broken Earth series, and this is actually the first time that I've reviewed quite a new book on BookTube that I know other people are reviewing and talking about a lot. So I'm almost a bit nervous about that because sometimes people can, emotions can run high about people's favourite books. First thing I have to say is that I did really enjoy this book. I think it was a Christmas present from my brother to Beau. Both of them have read it, both of them really enjoyed it, and with their combined recommendations, I'm not normally a big fantasy reader. It's a genre that I pretty much wrote off, but I'm gradually coming more and more to appreciate that. I always find fantasy books quite riveting, and this book was definitely a riveting fantasy book. I loved the world and the kind of magic system, for want of a better word. And one thing you can't really help noticing about this book is the way that it brings in issues of discrimination and marginalisation, and I think it's rare outside of fantasy. Coming as a non-fantasy generally reader, it's rare that you get themes like that brought in so heavy-handedly without them being sort of either the main issue of the book or just a natural occurrence based on the setting of the book. I think Jemisin brought these themes in very deliberately, and she wants us to be talking about them, but that is not what I'm going to look at today. So aside from oppression, racism and gender politics, the other really obvious thing about this book is the writing style. There are a couple of features to this. It's written in the present tense, which is, I know it's increasingly popular, but it's not the traditional way to write a story. That would be the past tense. And even in one thread, there's kind of 3 threads to this story, and one thread is in the second person. And if you are sitting there thinking, what the hell is the second person? If you think the first person is I do and the third person is he does or she does, then the second person is you do. So you are asked to very much inhabit a character in this book. And throughout the book there are also extracts from supposedly older texts which are written in equally unfamiliar forms, such as the imperative. So there's a very deliberate non-use of traditional methods of writing. But the other thing about style is that in several places it's not just normal prose in this book. So I thought we could take a close look at that and about what makes it not normal prose, and look at how N.K. Jemisin uses poetic techniques instead of prose techniques, or as well as prose techniques, in order to add emphasis at key moments of the 5th season. And by poetic techniques I mean techniques that are definitely used in prose literature by many authors much of the time, but techniques that are just more familiar from poetry, such as repetition, rhyme, enjambment, things that just don't tend to be the normal part of prose. There are also more ones that I won't talk about, such as alliteration, assonance. They all appear in this book. I just don't have time to talk about them all. Even the present tense itself, to me, I would say that's more a poetic kind of tense. More poetry is written in the present tense, historically at least, than prose. So I guess my argument is that this book has very deliberate elements of the prose poem to it in certain places, and I'm going to bring in a couple of examples of this and then sort of say whether it works for me. And as usual, I'm going to be avoiding any major spoilers about character or plot development, but simply because she uses these poetic techniques more at more important or impactful moments of the story, and part of making them impactful is these poetic techniques. There is going to be more kind of spoileriness than I would prefer. The furthest along I'm going to go is just over halfway, so that's as far as anything would go, and honestly they're not like telling you the whole plot. So the first technique that drew my attention was repetition, and that comes right at the start, at the end of the prologue. And by the way, if you're about to read this book and you haven't read it already, bear in mind that the prologue is not the best chapter in the book, which is kind of confusing because the first chapter is supposed to be the best chapter, isn't it? It's full of quite exaggerated language, and the style is very awkward compared to the rest of the book. It's like the author can't really decide where to place herself in this scene. So the repetition comes at the very end of the prologue, and the phrase that is repeated is, "This is the way the world ends." And this is impactful because we've already been introduced to the notion that this world, the stillness as it's called, is actually quite a risky and quite a mobile place. The world end has come up again and again throughout the prologue, prologue, and it gradually builds up this sense of an impending sort of apocalyptic event. And this phrase that I've just mentioned is repeated not once but twice, so it comes up 3 times in a row. And in the final repetition it is in italics, so Jemisin makes quite liberal use of italics throughout the book to add emphasis, and my impression is that she likes these very visual methods of adding emphasis to text. So it goes, on page 14, but this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends for the last time. And if you look at it on the page there, if I can show you slightly, and more importantly if you listen to it, it really acts like a verse rather than a paragraph. It's got quite a rhythm to it which really increases thanks to the repetition. So I'm going to try and clap it for you. It's going to be a bit silly, but you'll get the idea. But this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends for the last time. So it's like a chant, and it almost like it gets stuck in your head in that repeated chant-like way, and that rhythm builds up and up and up to the reveal of for the last time. The but at the start almost gets in the way a little bit because that's just to connect it into the more normal prose of the prologue. And the repetition, I think it works on a couple of levels. Firstly, it adds impact to this idea that has already been introduced of some kind of crisis that is about to happen or is happening to this world, and the repetition adds tension to that. We almost expect the explosion or whatever it could be to happen at the end of this, like, this is the way the world ends for the last time. We expect like that to be the moment when everything blows up. And secondly, the idea it has already been offered and will gradually be developed over the first few chapters, that the stillness as a world is quite prone to ending. The 5th season is the name that they give to this process, a great upheaval that significantly affects humanity's ability to survive. So the repetition of the phrase is akin to the repetition of the process within this world. So it develops for us this idea of a repeated ending, which in itself is not a very understandable concept because an ending should be only the once. But then it cuts into that confirmation of this weird concept of repeated endings by saying for the last time. It breaks with the rhythm and it breaks with the repetition, but it also breaks with the precedent that has just been set of this world being a place that ends frequently. It confirms for us that the world has ended multiple times, but it also tells us that this time that we are going to read about is different and it will be the last of the endings. So essentially with this poetic fragment, Jemisin introduces us to the event that is going to become so important to the rest of this series, as in the end of the world. Throughout the book there are many other moments when Jemisin uses rhythm and repetition to add to the poesy of her work in a way that is quite uncommon in prose. So prose is rarely particularly rhythmic, it flows quite smoothly apart from where there is a paragraph break, which is meant to give us a little mental hesitation automatically. Similarly, while repetition is definitely a frequently used effect in prose, the repetition might not be immediately one after the other, so it might be a repeated theme or a repeated idea that is brought up sort of later on in the book, as opposed to being repeated directly one thing after another. So it's more of an echo than a direct repetition in most prose. And in this next extract, Jemisin takes advantage of how unusual these techniques are in prose for not a big reveal, again, but to show emotion and give us some insight into the mental state of the character we are inhabiting. If you haven't read this book yet, this bit is going to mention a death, but it's a death that comes very early on, so I don't think hearing this will affect your enjoyment of the story too much at all, but it's your call. So on page 58 and 59, and the part that I'm looking at starts with just a normal sentence. These people killed Uche. Their hate, their fear, their unprovoked violence. He, killed your son. Jija killed your son. So we start with that normal sentence that I've mentioned, these people killed Uche. That has all the parts that a sentence is supposed to have. It's got a subject and an object and a verb, and it's complete in itself. And it's followed by a statement, their fear, their hate, their unprovoked violence, where the repetition of their is really a very accusatory, and it builds like 3 times repeated. Everyone knows that repeating something 3 times is like the golden number. Their hate, their fear, their unprovoked violence. So it builds this accusation against the group of people that she is with. But the use of a statement instead of a sentence is still fairly common. It's not too unusual. It's more in the next couple of phrases that we get something more unusual, starting with the conclusive simple word they on its own. And immediately after we have this conclusion, we get that line break, that automatic hesitation, and a change of approach. It's like the character and ourselves, as we are with the character, has this pause where they think, hang on, am I right about that? Is it they? And Jemisin is even using punctuation to add to this. The brackets show how the character Essen is processing or struggling to process what has happened and what kind of blame to assign for it, whether it belongs to an individual or the group. It's like an internal conversation as the sentences become split up. They, he, killed your son. Jija killed your son. It's almost like the word killed is trying to find its way to the right place in the sentence, because at first it's wrong, it's not accurate that these people killed Uche. And as that happens, it also becomes more personal. I was talking to one of my colleagues who has read this book. So nice to meet somebody who's read a book that you've read in the real world. And she is a mother, and she said she found all of these references, these quite full-on references to the loss of her son, quite difficult in a way. So it goes from being Uche to being your son, and that is where the impact is built in terms of on a personal, emotional level. Finally, we get to the right sentence, the true sentence. Jija killed your son, where the subject and the object are both correct. It is Jija, and he did do the act of killing your son. It's almost like Essen, although she did know this already, has just fully realised and accepted that statement as true. But it's in brackets again. And what do those brackets mean? They mean that this realisation is no longer really relevant. It doesn't matter who killed Uche. Accurately, the open and acknowledged blame remains with the wider group of people. So that gets us wondering as well. Why, if she knows that it's Jija, why is she holding the rest of the town responsible? That's something that she goes on to explore a little bit more about, why people feel the way that they felt about Uche that built up to his death. The next extract that I want to discuss is much further into the book, and it's about here, page 262 to 263, and I think it's a relatively important event. I'm not sure how important because I haven't read the whole trilogy. I get the impression that it might be an event that might come up again later on. So if you haven't read the book yet, it might be safest just to skip ahead. This extract, when you read it, almost doesn't mean very much, and it doesn't sound very poetic. It's more visually poetic, if you see what I mean. One of the ways that poetry works is about how it is arranged on the page and how it looks on the page, and this part looks very distinctive, and it shows Jemisin very deliberately using the kind of almost like a verse-like looking structure to draw our attention to these parts of the page and show us before we've even read it that big things are happening here, which you know because you've just read this page and things are really building up. But the moment you turn the page from this is like a normal prose looking page, and you turn over and it's not normal. You've got these two big gaps. The first one is here, and it's like an expression of disbelief and struggling to keep up. And it's just and then, and then, and then, each followed by a dash which has no real resolution. And that gap that produces is mirrored at the end of the page here with and then the obelisk shatters, which in itself is a normal sentence. But because of the enjambment between the words, it becomes more of a verse than a sentence. It's broken into 3 lines, like those 3 lines up at the top there. By enjambment, I mean a poetic technique in which a line ends without a punctuation ending. I think that's about right. So instead of having a full stop or a comma or a dash, we just skip straight to the next line. It's a long-standing poetic technique. I think it's more popular in modern poetry, and it allows you to make a line break without necessarily using anything like rhyme or so on. I mentioned earlier on about how line and paragraph breaks in prose have the effect of causing a sort of instant pause for us as readers, but if anything, enjambment has the opposite effect because there's no punctuation, so we're left seeking that resolution to the phrase, that all-important full stop at the end, and that rushes our eyes straight down this column, lending emphasis to that last word, shatters. And it's almost as well, this arrangement of the 2 gaps, it almost draws your eyes as you read these and then at the top. I know it drew mine when I was reading it. I couldn't stop myself. I read these and then I skipped straight to here because it almost leads naturally across, because there's this gap here, and it feels like this is the filling of the gap. And I think that's almost deliberate, because the events on this page happen in a matter of seconds, and it's almost like between this moment and this moment, like that, the time it takes you to read this and this is the time it takes for all of this to happen. So it's almost like this is what you would perceive if you were just watching the scene, and this is all of the things that happen in the scene that you experience. Jemisin definitely wants us to read this whole page fast. Like I said, the events happen really, really quickly, and it's quite a climactic moment, and that's why it needs to be hurried along, so that we hurry towards this climax of shattering Obelisk. Between the 2 points where the shape of the prose is changed, the flow is also broken throughout by a series of dashes. If you can see, there's one here and here and here and here. And they keep us in suspense as no sentence is properly concluded. The action is just jumping about from sentence to sentence. We're trying to get to grips with what's going on, and like the characters, we are struggling to make sense of these rapidly unfolding events, and to string them together in a coherent way and work out what is going on. And that again speeds us along through these paragraphs to that final sentence, and then the obelisk shatters, and that final word again shatters. And we finally know what the problem is. We finally know why that looming obelisk is so important. And from the suspense of wondering what is going on in this scene and what's happening from one sentence to the next, we finally know what is going on, but we don't know what happens next. We go from this kind of minor suspense into a bigger cliffhanger type suspense, because it's the end of a chapter. The next chapter's with different characters. We know it's important because she's made it look so important, and we have to wait to find that out. So that's one of the bits in the book where the prose most looks like a poem, even though it doesn't necessarily sound like a poem like it did in the more rhythmic ones. So there we have just a couple of examples of how Jemisin uses poetic techniques in her prose to add to the pace or the emotion or the impact of an event. There are definitely other moments of poetry-like passages in this book and other techniques that are used, and sometimes she very openly uses poetic techniques in proverbs and phrases that are supposed to be kind of like historic. The next question is, do these techniques work in the book? And I have a bit of a hesitant answer to this, because for me they worked better as I went back and picked them out than they did when I was first actually just reading the book. Much as I loved this book, on my first read through I very much had the sense that it was quite self-conscious, and that the author felt like she couldn't be satisfied with writing just a gripping fantasy book, but she had to kind of justify that by adding a lot more literary features or political statements to it. Possibly more than were necessary to the actual story and to a reader's enjoyment of the story. But if you have read the 5th season, please let me know what you think. Did you notice these techniques? Whether you did or didn't notice them at the time, do you think that they worked for you? Did they do the things that I've said that they might do? And do you agree with me that they're a little bit self-conscious, or do you think that they are just natural for N.K. Jemisin? And what do you think in general of this idea of shaking up prose and making it look more poetic, or making it feel more poetic? Meanwhile, have a lovely day, and I will speak to you soon.